These are the stories of 10 of the greatest paintings in the world. I'm Andrew Marr. Art, not politics, is the great passion of my life. For me, it gets to the heart of what it is to be human. In galleries across the globe, there are great paintings, works made with almost supernatural skill, fierce passion, and extraordinary brain power. Now I want to tell stories behind some of the most iconic images in history, pictures like Leonardo's Mona Lisa, Van Gogh's Sunflowers, and Turner's Fighting Temeraire, paintings that represent the pinnacle of what people can do with paint and bristles.
He created a brand new way of depicting the world. The colours would fizz and pop on the surface.
It was like you could touch these people. It was like the portrait could speak to you.
Behind every picture, there is a story. I'm going to peel back the layers to find out more about the lives of their creators and the worlds they came from.
There was something about this middle-class Florentine housewife that intrigued him.
Why are these the paintings we all know and love? How were they created? And what makes them the greatest paintings in the world? All around the world, there are great galleries and museums crammed with beautiful art, which are open to everybody, free to all of us. Sometimes that's because of an act of national determination. Sometimes it's because of an individual bequest or legacy. When this one, Tate Britain, opened its doors first in 1897, it was the gift to the British of a Liverpool sugar merchant. Sir Henry Tate's great thing was sugar cubes, but his other great thing was British art, and he wanted to share his obsessive love of it with the rest of us. Tate began this gallery with 65 of his own fine and memorable paintings, and at the heart of that collection there was one particularly special piece. It's been famous since before the gallery was built, and it's still its most popular picture. The Victorians loved it, and so do we. It is luscious, gorgeous to look at, but this is not a pretty story. It's a young, disturbed woman's suicide by drowning. I'm talking, of course, about John Everett Millais' Ophelia. You'd need to be a cold fish not to be moved. Simultaneously beautiful and deeply shocking, Ophelia is the crowning achievement of one of the most skilled and ambitious painters of Victorian Britain. Millais was considered an absolute genius with a paintbrush. He could do almost anything. Flowers fresh, flowers drenched and drowning, little touches of sunlight on leaves, a face perfectly rendered, wet hair sinking into the water. Others had painted Ophelia before, but nothing like this. It isn't stagey or really melodramatic. Here is a real woman, briefly suspended in living water, almost ecstatic in her despair. So who was this doomed and dying figure? How was Ophelia captured on canvas, and why does this image still hold such an important place in one of the greatest art collections in the world? To really understand this image, we have to go back to the very beginnings of its life, because behind the romantic scene lies a much darker and more revolutionary story. It's a tale of a major artistic rebellion, of ruthless ambition, and Victorian macabre. But before all of that, we start decorously, in a far more conventional setting, just 2 miles from where Ophelia now hangs, in the place that mattered most to any aspiring Victorian painter, the Royal Academy of Arts. It was here, in December 1840, that an extraordinary young painter was first introduced to the Victorian art scene.
Millais was a child prodigy. He went to art school at a very young age and he got into the Royal Academy when he was just 11 years of age.
He was the youngest ever person to attend the Royal Academy as a student. Prior to that, the youngest had been Turner, who went at the age of 14, which in itself was quite prodigious.
That's a record the young Millais still holds today. The Royal Academy was the only place to gain an art education. But to survive there, the young prodigy would have to bend himself to its rigor, its traditions, and above all, its taste.
You were told very much what you had to do, what paint palette you were allowed to use, what subject matter was appropriate for the stage of your learning.
You were meant to be painting portraits, landscapes, genre painting, often perhaps with some kind of moral tale.
Many artists were frustrated by the fact that the teachings of Joshua Reynolds, who died in 1792, were still being taught as the only way to look at art.
But even with these traditionalist teaching techniques, from the beginning, Millais' exceptional eye for detail, the very skill that would shine through in his Ophelia, won him fame and applause.
Millais was a great success at the Royal Academy. Even though he only went in when he was 11, he was winning awards and medals for his drawings and his paintings.
There's a wonderful picture of the Duke of Sussex handing the young Millais his silver medal, and you can hardly see Millais because he's so small. He has to bend down to this little boy who's shown with his lovely gold hairs and his little pantaloons.
Millais excelled at history paintings, big canvases depicting moral themes from well-known stories of the past. In 1846, he exhibited Pizarro seizing the Inca of Peru, and 1 year later, at just 18 years old, he received a gold medal for his painting The Tribe of Benjamin seizing the daughters of Shiloh. By the men at the top, he was adored, and yet, behind its closed doors, Millais was becoming increasingly frustrated with this cramping institution. Revolutions in art tend to happen after a time of stagnation. And in the 1840s, British painting was frankly in a poor way. Most of the greats, including Constable, were dead. And apart from the elderly Turner, then thought to be in his decline, there was nobody for the young Millais to look up to, which was a great stroke of luck, because it meant he had to rely on his own resources, think harder, and make his own way. Well, I say his own way, but not entirely, because in a second stroke of luck, he was surrounded by a group of equally impatient and almost as talented friends. Two other young artists, Dante Gabriel Rossetti and William Holman Hunt, shared Millais' frustrations with the revered Royal Academy.
They began to be rather critical. They felt that all the students were coming out and they were producing these rather brown, lacklustre paintings, which had no real connection to the society in which they were living.
Unlike all artists, they wanted to go their own way. They wanted to show their own talent.
So in 1848, the trio vowed to work together, igniting an extraordinary period of creativity. Aged just 19 years old, the teenage Millais was about to transform the story of British painting forever and create an image that would shock the mid-Victorian establishment. John Everett Millais' Ophelia is one of the oldest and most popular pieces in Tate Britain's collection. This painting is so photoreal, so throbbing with vivid, lush colour, that it's hard to remember it owes nothing at all to any camera or lens, but was painted meticulously by hand in the depths of Victorian London more than 150 years ago. It packs an immediate punch. It looks different because it was meant to look different. It was the product of an artistic plot or conspiracy, if you like, that shook the Victorian art world. And it all began in the summer of 1848 in this small, nondescript house in central London, with three daring young chancers, all under the age of 22. John Everett Millais, William Holman Hunt, and the hot-headed, flashy painter and poet Dante Gabriel Rossetti.
So these are young rebels. They want to cause a stir, a reaction, and they are defiantly rejecting what they have been taught by an older generation.
They called themselves the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and even the name was a provocation. The now stale influence of the great Renaissance master Raphael was being cast off by the bold young radicals as a counter-revolution of spirituality based on naturalism now began.
It was very brave of the PRBs to do what they actually did, forming themselves and going against the Royal Academy, but they really believed in themselves.
These young artists who knew they were going to be provocative and they were going to be shocking to the public named themselves PRB, the little initials in the corner, so it's almost like a secret society.
A lot of academicians were really upset and they were quite shocked. You know, we've trained these students and this is what they're producing. They're rejecting us. These artists dismissing these time-honoured conventions of painting.
Within weeks, more like-minded young artists, fascinated by this radical new approach, joined Millais, Rossetti and Hunt. In their paintings, the rebellion unleashed an entirely new palette, paving the way for Millais' Ophelia.
The Pre-Raphaelite movement was revolutionary because their pictures just looked so different to everything else on display. The works were vivid and bright, with colours placed in juxtaposition.
They tried to show things as they really were. One of their tenets was truth to nature. So they would go outside, they would paint in the open air, and they would faithfully record everything that they saw. This was hugely radical.
So their pictures did actually look different, and they immediately demanded attention.
This revolutionary new society made their first big splash with Millais' attention-demanding Christ in the House of His Parents. Now displayed in Tate Britain, it's one of the artist-educator Richard Thomas's favourite pieces.
It went on show at the Royal Academy annual exhibition in May 1850, and he was 20 years old. So this is his coming-of-age exhibition. The first thing that happened for people looking at it was that they were drawn into responding to the subject in the painting as if it was an incident in a perfectly ordinary carpenter's workshop. But that's not just a little boy who's cut his hand. This is the Holy Family with Mary, Jesus and Joseph, and Mary's mother, St. Anne.
Everything about this painting reflected the new and almost extremist principles of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood.
Millais decided to paint the picture not in his studio, but on location in an actual carpenter's workshop in order to get the authentic feel. To get the effect of the vivid blood, Millais actually cut his own hand. You can see the chipped and dirty toenails of St. Joseph.
He thought this was one of his masterpieces. And until this time, Millais had been adored, so he didn't expect to really get a backlash. But in general, people took against this painting. One of the biggest problems was that Millais had portrayed the Holy Family as working class. This was really, really shocking to people. They didn't like it.
It's failing to do what people expect of a religious painting. It's failing to illustrate the sacred text. It's inserting an additional story. It's daring in a number of ways.
The Virgin Mary is not represented as some beautiful Raphaelesque type. She's shown as a woman who looks rather sort of haggard and grief-stricken. It was seen to be blasphemous.
Ignoring all the pallid Madonnas and cute Christs that had come before him, Millais' religious realism was entirely unexpected. The Victorians already had a mental image of the Holy Family, and they hadn't looked like this.
One of the biggest critics of this particular painting was Charles Dickens. Now, Dickens was not an art critic. However, he had an awful lot of sway.
And his criticism is utterly hostile. He describes the Christ child as a hideous, wry-necked, blubbering, red-headed boy with a bedgown. The Virgin is described as a kneeling woman so horrible in her ugliness that she would stand out from the rest of the company as a monster in the vilest cabaret in France or the lowest gin shop in England. So he's utterly dismissive of this coarse realism.
The Pre-Raphaelites may only recently have been founded, but thanks to Millais, their reputation was already shot to pieces. News of the scandal even reached Queen Victoria, who demanded to see Millais' blasphemous work for herself. The young artist was devastated.
After the shock of the reception of Christ in the house of his parents, Millais was determined to make the art world love him again, to get his reputation back. He wasn't going to compromise, but he was going to make sure that his next painting was adored.
And for that, there was no better place for Millais to turn than the theatre.
Theatre was very popular. When people went out for entertainment, they went to the theatre, and Shakespeare was extremely popular.
It was a bit of everything that the Victorians liked. There was death involved, there was love involved, a bit of almost eroticism.
The Victorian public adored their Shakespeare. Even those who couldn't read had been to the theatre and were well versed in his stories. So as the topic for story painting, Shakespeare was a shrewd choice, especially as Millais plucked out one of the most dramatic moments in one of the most popular plays of them all. So this is the famous moment in Shakespeare's Hamlet when Hamlet's beloved Ophelia decides to kill herself. She has been driven mad because Hamlet appears no longer to love her and has been mocking her in a rather cruel way, and he has just killed her father. So for her, life is over.
It was a really popular subject with artists. A lot of artists known to Millais, Arthur Hughes, Richard Redgrave, had painted the death of Ophelia. But they'd done it in a picturesque way, where she's sort of just tripping over the bank and stepping into the water.
Millais, however, took a closer look at Shakespeare's immortal lines. Her clothes spread wide and mermaid-like, a while they bore her up, which time she chanted snatches of old tunes as one incapable of her own distress, or like a creature native and endued unto the element, but long it could not be, till that her garments, heavy with their drink, pulled the poor wretch from her melodious lay to muddy death. Snatches of old songs, the waterlogged dress, inconsolable in her misery. Bound by the Brotherhood's rules, Millais wanted to bring all of this vividly to life. But to do that, he needed the perfect poor wretch, a model whose face he dearly hoped would become unforgettable. The answer to his Ophelia was a young hat seller called Lizzy Sidle.
Lizzy Siddal was working in a milliner's shop just off Leicester Square in London, and she was a rather unusual-looking woman for her time. She was a young woman who was very, very slim.
Long red hair, very pale skin, very tall. She was discovered by Millais' friend, who went to the milliner's and saw her and just thought she'd be perfect for the Pre-Raphaelites. And she became their model. But she was also an artist in her own right.
She was quite intellectual and loved poetry, painting.
Rossetti loved her, Millais loved her. Everybody wanted to paint her.
She essentially became the Pre-Raphaelite supermodel.
Millais now had his Ophelia, but how would he transform a 22-year-old Victorian hat seller into his doomed Shakespearean? How could he bring his canvas to life unless his model lived and breathed her distress? Ophelia and her watery suicide had to feel real. It was the beginning of a painstaking process as carefully planned as any military maneuver.
It wasn't just the figure that was important, so like Ophelia. The background was just as important.
The scene in Hamlet takes place in a remote corner of Denmark, but Millais needed somewhere a little handier for central London. Today, his great-great-grandson, art historian Dr. Roger Bowdler, is retracing Millais' steps for the first time.
Oh my goodness. It's just a fabulous feeling, actually having found the precise spot where he spent weeks and weeks and weeks in the summer of 1851 painting Ophelia, and it's here. And this isn't the most romantic or glamorous of settings. You know, you can hear the M3 in the background, it's in the edge of Greater London, and it's covered in litter. But actually that almost makes the magic of the picture the greater. The drama is about her imminent sinking below the water. So he doesn't want a grand, picturesque setting. He wants rather a modest riverbank to paint, and that's just what he finds.
To work outside, Millais capitalized on two exciting new innovations: small portable paint tubes and a host of new pigments and colors. His Ophelia would be the brightest canvas he'd ever produced, but working for so long outdoors still brought with it a whole catalogue of challenges.
He would spend up to 11 hours a day in great discomfort. He complained about the flies, about being threatened by a big bull.
He had farmers shouting at him. People would come past and ask him what he was doing.
And he has to deal with this pair of swans. They take up station just where he's found his spot and completely muck up the water weeds that he's so carefully selected for the setting of the painting.
Millais wrote, "My martyrdom is more trying than any I have hitherto experienced. Certainly, the painting of a picture under such circumstances would be a greater punishment to a murderer than hanging." These were the lengths the Pre-Raphaelites were willing to go to in order to capture nature as truthfully as possible.
He paints with fantastic finesse, which is why it takes him so long. So he begins work on this in early July. He's still here in early December.
He would say that it was like completing the size of a 5-penny piece each day. So that gives you a sense of how slow and gradual this process was.
He's putting his all into it because his reputation depends on success. So there's a discipline at work, along with the very romantic, poetic engagement of this poignant scene of watery death in this river.
But while Millais himself was more than happy to suffer for his art, even he realized that persuading Lizzy to dunk herself for hours in the cold and dirty waters of a Thames tributary might be going a little too far. And so back in central London, he came up with a somewhat less unpleasant alternative, but only somewhat.
Millais poses her in his studio, in his parents' house, in a bathtub, and he finds in an antique shop a beautiful antique dress with silver embroidery. And Lizzy Siddal is posed wearing this in the bathtub.
Now, Lizzy was being painted in December, long before central heating, and it was cold. It was in a basement studio. The lamps underneath the bath were kept lit in order to keep the water at an even temperature. But one day, Millais didn't notice that the lamps had gone out. The water, of course, just got colder and colder, and Lizzy lay there, the perfect artist model, suffering for his art as he completed his picture.
Millais' quest for realism had given his muse pneumonia. But although he was forced to pay for Lizzy's doctor's bills, there may have been a dark part of him that was quietly and privately pleased.
I think that the fact that Lizzy Siddal did suffer whilst posing did inject that extra sense of realism and naturalism to the face that he painted while she was lying there in the bath, freezing.
Millais had thrown everything at this piece, stretching himself to the limits of his already extraordinary abilities. And yet it had almost cost the life of his model, and even after months of toil, he still wasn't finished. This was perhaps his last chance to not only save his reputation, but that of his fellow Pre-Raphaelites. So would his Ophelia be the great hit that Millais craved? John Everett Millais' Ophelia, the jewel in Tate Britain's collection, may be one of the most popular pieces of art of the 19th century, but it's definitely not for everyone. There is something about this picture, perhaps its extreme prettiness, a dash of sentimentality that does not quite work for me. Perhaps I'm already too old. That is, when I first started looking at paintings and loving paintings back in the 1970s, modernism was all the rage, and Victorian pictures telling stories were deeply unfashionable. But we all have to challenge our prejudices, don't we? And it may be strange thought, unlikely thought, that I am completely wrong. And with this iconic canvas and its exquisite detail all to myself, it's very hard not to appreciate the sheer artistry. So first of all, this is about two things for which the Pre-Raphaelites are very well known. Rich, luscious, almost enameled colour, and a detail so sharp you could cut your fingers on it. Where in the history of art have you ever seen a green as greeny as that green? Not since the very early Renaissance, I think. It is absolutely gorgeous, and the detail of the foliage is extraordinary. At times, he must have been using a brush with a single hair. And so, yes, perhaps, I may have been a little hasty. Looking again with fresh eyes, the subject is creepy, but it's impossible not to admire the way Millais makes his colours glow and his brushes dance. A touch of blue here, a flicker of white there. He applies shades and highlights with nerveless accuracy. He managed somehow, with the rest of the Pre-Raphaelites, to wash and rinse the colours so they glowed more freely and brightly than they had for a very, very long time. And they astonished the Victorians, and frankly, they are still astonishing us today.
There is this remarkable kind of hyper-real quality in the painting. And one of the ways he achieved this effect was to use a white ground, using lead white and zinc white. And the effect of that was to create this kind of backlit quality to these very bright primary colours that he's using.
And the wonderful passages of observation, those two hands, which will stand out like pieces of collage on the canvas. And it really conveys the impression of, this water just sinking into the dress. It's just dragging her bit by bit under the water.
The Pre-Raphaelites' hopes for a new art live in every inch of this canvas. It throbs with zest and confidence. It is everything the movement had hoped painting could be. It took Millais months, but finally, in early 1852, Ophelia was finished. The question for Millais was now, was it worth it? Would the Victorian public feel half as strongly about this astonishing picture as did the artist himself?
When the painting went on display at the Royal Academy in 1852, there was a very mixed reaction, actually.
Some people thought it was a very unconventional representation of Ophelia. Someone described her death as if she were in a weedy ditch. Others felt it was just too bright, vivid and gaudy.
There was so much going on, so much symbolism, that viewers almost had to work at it. They had to study it really hard. And at first, people were a little bit shocked, but within a very short time, it was applauded.
People thought Millais has really captured something quite extraordinary. Tom Taylor, who wrote for The Times, when he saw the face of Ophelia, he just described himself as just crying with emotion because he'd made the death so beautiful.
Millais' masterpiece had been quickly snapped up by a private collector, but while it remained on public display, Ophelia proved to be a huge draw. And whether they liked it or not, the Royal Academy could no longer cast out its arrogant prodigal son.
The painting is really important in terms of Millais' career. It marks a watershed. Suddenly, his paintings become emotional. and he becomes seen as a painter of pathos and empathy. And there are accounts of people just become overcome with emotion at seeing Ophelia, and at that point, his reputation changes. And from this point onwards, it's really an upward trajectory.
Just a year after Ophelia was displayed, Millais was chosen as an Academy Associate, an act which would have been unthinkable 3 years earlier. The establishment he had rejected and which had loudly rejected him was suddenly embracing the stiff-backed young radical. But if Ophelia had been about tapping into popular taste, then, unfortunately, Millais now didn't know when to stop.
So from 1853 onwards, Millais starts to feel that he doesn't have to stick entirely to the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood's principles. He sticks to a lot of them, but he starts to experiment.
He becomes a highly successful commercial artist, a painter of genre scenes, of landscapes. His style relaxes, but also I think he becomes just bored, dissatisfied with that pre-Raphaelite, very finicky manner. He wants to develop as an artist. Artists always have to change and evolve.
He became a fashionable portraitist, painting rich people's portraits, and a lot of artists said that he sold out, but he was making a living.
Most of the public just loved him. They couldn't get enough of Millais. He started to paint a lot of crowd-pleasing pictures, often of little children, because that was the fashion.
He becomes the darling of the British public.
A revolutionary no longer, Millais' later work, which even included a saccharine advert for Pear's soap, bore no relation to his pre-Raphaelite canvases. He became firmly part of the establishment. In 1896, aged 67, he was even elected Royal Academy President. But whereas Ophelia had once represented the peak of the Pre-Raphaelite movement in all its non-conformist glory, now it marked the beginning of their demise. Holman Hunt and the increasingly eccentric Rossetti would be left to forge their own paths, and their great muse Lizzy, immortalized in their paintings, would begin a terrifying parallel trajectory in real life. Millais' painting had almost killed her, and now she was going to become Ophelia-like in an entirely new way.
People clamoured to come and see this painting. And in fact, for Lizzy Siddal, in some ways, it was a double-edged sword. She became very famous because of it.
Through her association with Rossetti, she really begins to pick up her art again, painting and drawings, often portraying scenes of lovers or couples in complicated psychological situations. She also starts to write her own poetry and verse.
Lizzy was a sophisticated pre-Raphaelite artist in her own right, much more than the model in the movement's most iconic piece. But her relationship with Rossetti was incredibly tempestuous. He was a serial cheat, and Lizzy didn't make the easiest partner herself.
Perhaps the biggest problem in their relationship on her side was that she was a laudanum addict. And laudanum was an opiate. It was opium in alcohol, incredibly addictive. And it was a real social ill of the 19th century, particularly amongst women.
Depressed, unappreciated, and darkly miserable, Lizzy could not control her addiction. And tragically, on the 11th of February, 1862, aged just 32, she killed herself with a suspected overdose.
People have often associated the tragic early death of Elizabeth Siddal with the early death of Ophelia. So there is this conflation between art and life. That's what's so sort of magical and sort of, slightly sort of sinister or uncanny about Pre-Raphaelite paintings. Often art and life do converge.
When Lizzy was buried, Rossetti did a very romantic gesture. He placed in her coffin, between her cheek and her hair, his only copy of his poems that he'd written. He claimed that they were all about her, that love had died with her. He was deeply grief-stricken.
With Ophelia sold and in private hands, the Pre-Raphaelites disbanded, and Millais now creating mainstream art for the masses, it looked as if the importance and significance of this remarkable painting would start to fade. But neither Lizzy Siddal nor Millais' Ophelia were going to be forgotten, because something was about to happen in that graveyard which would lodge the young model and the painting deep in the Victorian popular imagination. Millais' great canvas, Ophelia, has continued to capture our imagination almost 170 years since it was first exhibited, and I think that's in part because its subject matter transcends any age or any era. There is no moment in the human story so cold, so lonely, and so bleak as deciding to take your own life. Ophelia killed herself because she had been so badly betrayed she was demented. And she did it in a particularly grim way. But what also added to the intrigue, mystery, and perhaps the popularity of this canvas was that it was an act reflected by the untimely death of Millais' own muse, and Victorian Britain would be aghast at what happened next. Lizzy Siddal was buried in Highgate Cemetery, Rossetti's handwritten poetry tucked neatly behind her long flowing red hair. But this tragic woman was not going to be allowed to rest in peace, because just 6 years later, Rossetti decided that he wanted his poetry back, which was tricky, because you could hardly dig her up again. Or could he? By 1869, Rossetti couldn't bear the thought of his Pre-Raphaelite poetry being lost to the world any longer. And so alongside his friend Charles Augustus Howell, he hatched a macabre plan to retrieve the poems from Lizzy's grave.
They'd done it by bonfire light, and the coffin had been exhumed and the lid had been taken off, and allegedly, according to Howell, there was Lizzy perfect. She wasn't a skeleton, she was miraculously preserved. He claimed that her hair had grown so much it filled the whole coffin. Rossetti wanted to believe it, that Lizzy was the beautiful supermodel in death, just as she'd been in life.
Rossetti published the poems, which he'd received with a wormhole running through them. They didn't go down well. By the time he died 13 years later, he was a thin spectre of the man who'd helped found the Pre-Raphaelites back in 1848. And yet, a mythology began to grow around the image of Lizzy, captured for eternity as the epitome of the betrayed woman.
She's sort of a heroine for women that suffered at the fate of drugs and men and being a muse.
A lot of women now model themselves on Elizabeth Siddal, and the Elizabeth Siddal look is now rather fashionable. If you think of performers such as Florence Welsh with the red hair, pale complexion, the flowing garments.
Perhaps one reason why Lizzy Siddal still captures the imagination is that her own suicide is so neatly captured in the painting of her by Millais as Ophelia. The fact that she was the most famous suicide in art history and then becomes a suicide in real life is something that continues to resonate with people.
There's no denying this is a great Victorian horror story. But Lizzy Siddal, the face of the Pre-Raphaelite movement, should not be remembered just as a beautiful victim. We look at Lizzy Siddal in this picture, and she is entirely passive, almost surrendered. And we have to remember that this was a woman who, in her real life, was an artist and a writer, a poet herself. It is a great, great injustice that the way we remember her is only as a passive, sinking woman in a famous painting and as a corpse being ravaged for somebody else's poetry long after her death. And yet, even now, Lizzy couldn't quite rest in peace. The painting of Ophelia had vanished into the private art world not long after it had been completed. But now it had reached the eye of one very important man.
In 1892, Henry Tate purchases the picture. Henry Tate is a sugar magnate. He's made his fortune from sugar refining. He patents the sugar cube.
There was only one thing that Tate loved more than sugar: art, and in particular, Pre-Raphaelite art. Over the last few years, he'd collected an extraordinary number of paintings, and now he wanted to share them with the nation.
He loved the idea of a national gallery that people of all social classes could go to.
A site is decided upon, which is the old Millbank Penitentiary. It's a site which will be transformed into this public gallery, which will be free of charge for the public, particularly for the working poor of the Millbank area.
A cutting-edge art gallery in one of the poorest areas of the city. That was a mighty risk. The question on everyone's lips was, would Ophelia help pull in big crowds? And the answer was a resounding yes.
The gallery opens in 1897, and Ophelia is an immediate hit with the public. People flock to see it.
It was one of those that people were told to sort of stand back, don't jostle. They had to have a lot of guards checking that people didn't get too close to the painting. And it's remained one of the most successful paintings of the Tate ever since.
This haunting canvas has spoken to generation after generation since it was first hung here more than 120 years ago. Millais' Ophelia is a masterwork by a master painter. He was a young revolutionary taking on the establishment, and then, very quickly, the perils of success. He became the establishment himself, and he was much mocked for turning out cute, sentimental pictures, some of them used in advertising as sweet as any sugar cube manufactured by Sir Henry Tate himself. But this here still shows all his defiance and his optimism. It is a young man's shout hanging on these establishment walls. No, I still don't love it, but I salute it for its vividness and its energy. And anyway, Marr, you old fool, the rest of the world disagrees. Next time, this was a painting that was not supposed to be seen by the public. It was private art, strictly for behind closed doors. The story of a ravishing beauty and the revolution she stirred.
He would have put it on the bonfire and watched it burn.
This could only be Sandro Botticelli's The Birth of Venus.